Welcome to the Design Materials channel. I am Edson Mafuz, architect and professor of architectural design at the School of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil. I'm back with another video on architectural design, this time to talk about the vertical limits of buildings, the facades, which are usually their most visible parts. Robert Venturi in the 1960s went so far as to say that the facade is the place where architecture takes place, as it is the element that synthesizes the internal and external forces that act in every project. I start from the premise that the facade is more than its two-dimensional manifestation, encompassing the entire thickness of the vertical boundary and all the elements used to define it in each case, as we shall see. Initially, a caveat. The discussion developed here is based on an ancient tradition whereby buildings have walls and roofs. Since the buildings you see on the screen deliberately abandon that tradition, traditional modes of analysis do not apply to them. Thus, the term facade is meaningless when applied to continuous surfaces that surround the building, being both a facade and a roof without being any of these elements. Therefore, what follows does not include this kind of architecture. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the facade was part of the building's support system, which explains its thickness and the number and size of its openings. The traditional facade played an important representative role. The classical building is fundamentally a masonry box in which the opaque predominate over the void. That is, the area of the openings is always smaller than that of the wall, and on which elements taken from historical styles were applied. This has been the case for many centuries. In Roman antiquity, Greek orders were used to articulate the facades of buildings such as the Colosseum. In all the buildings that you saw just now, the applied elements are never structural. At most, they support their own weight. They are basically decorative elements that have nothing to do with the actual holding the building up. It is well known that in the beginning of the 20th century there was a rupture, a break that radically altered the way facades were designed. But nothing happens suddenly. There are always partial changes that pave the way for the break. For example, already at the end of the 18th century, it is possible to find projects in which the decorative elements are reduced to a minimum. In the second half of the 19th century, there is a crisis that provides the basis for what would come in the first decades of the following century. Part of the crisis was due to the fact that architecture remained attached to the practice of building thick masonry facades when there were already techniques that allowed for less massive constructions, as we can see in Viollet-le-Duc's projects. Another component of this crisis was the realization that the ornamental elements applied to architecture no longer had the same capacity for communication as in centuries past. In the last decades of the 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th century, technological advances, especially regarding steel and concrete construction, had the consequence of expanding the design possibilities of facades. At first, there was an increase in the size and number of openings. This is one of the most striking features of the early work of pioneers such as Perret, Wright, Le Corbusier, and many others. They show a reduction in the opaque sections of wall and an increase in the size of openings, in addition to the frequent adoption of horizontality in their layout. The domino scheme is what allows and represents the modern break. From there, the facade acquires total independence in relation to the support of the building and becomes an autonomous entity without the obligation to externalize what happens inside. With this, the size and the extension of the openings increase until they occupy the entire facade, and it becomes possible to avoid the interruptions caused by the points of support, the pillars or columns. However, the facade continues to exist as a design theme, as Le Corbusier's concerns about the proportional control of his projects demonstrate. In the 1930s, the facade began to recover the three-dimensionality that had been replaced by glazed surfaces. The element responsible for this is the brise-soleil, the sunshade that, allegedly introduced in modern architecture by Le Corbusier, becomes almost a trademark of Brazilian architecture after the construction of buildings such as the Ministry of Education and Health, Obra do Berço, Brazilian Association of Press, and the Santos Dumont Airport. While in their first appearances the brise soleil are a kind of projection from the glass surface, in the late architecture of Le Corbusier, especially in the projects made for India and Brasilia, they gain independence and become perforated walls which, according to Alan Kuhn, restore the transitional space between interior and exterior that was lost when the solid wall was destroyed and replaced by impenetrable and dimensionless skin. In the 1970s, there were plenty of comments on the loss of the representative capacity of modern architecture. In the wake of these criticisms, several architects associated with the so-called postmodernism criticized modern architecture for its supposed lack of communication. One of the remedies for this evil, proposed by Robert Venturi, consisted of the disconnection between the facade and the body of the building. The body would take care of the functional needs, while the facade would be dedicated to the symbolic aspect of the building, opening the door to an infinity of cartoonish works without relevance, in most cases using historical elements out of context in the name of a supposed relationship with tradition. Venturi himself would be the author of some of these caricatural designs. However, there was not exactly a loss of communicative capacity, but a change in what was represented. While pre-modern buildings referred to political, religious, and cultural themes through applied ornamentation, their counterpart in the 20th century alluded to components of the program or highlighted the construction system. In Mies van der Rohe's architecture, what one sees is a representation of the structure as a visual system, rather than the structural elements themselves. Thus, the facade never stopped representing something. It just changed focus. If, on the one hand, postmodernism was characterized by the search for recovery of the literal representativeness of the facade, which resulted in a production marked by pastiche and parody, on the other hand, instead of returning to the applied three-dimensional ornament, there were those who took advantage of advances in glass technology to print on the facade images associated with the program, in an update of the talking architecture parlante of times gone by. Labrouste's bibliothèque is a good example of a building that is sparse in its applied decoration, here consisting partially of the names of the writers to be found inside written on the second floor wall, and that takes advantage of the advances in cast iron construction as can be seen in its fantastic reading room. A late reflection of the facade's physical independence from the building's support is the understanding that it may have no connection with its spatial configuration and its interior uses, which usually results in a reduction of the facade to a mere vehicle of irrelevant visual effects, although it may be well designed and executed. The best that has been produced in contemporary architecture does not conceive of the facade as an X-ray of the interior, but neither does it treat it as an independent element design-wise. The most successful facades derive their general configuration from the constitution of the volume they limit. Their components reveal the rhythm of the resistant structure, the grain of the spatial structure, the greater or lesser need for protection, etc., without being a direct consequence of them. After the postmodernist interlude, in which the focus of the discussion was almost exclusively on the appearance of the buildings, it can be said that in recent decades the discussion has broadened, going well beyond the communicative or representative issue, emphasizing the role that facades can play as regulators of environmental comfort in the interior. It already seems to be a widespread belief that an efficient facade from the point of view of comfort and energy conservation cannot use a single material and be reduced to a single layer. Its basic configuration today consists of an internal layer, an air chamber, which can be occupied by insulating material, and an external layer, which can use almost any materials, from the simplest to the most sophisticated. Driven by a general concern with comfort and sustainability, architects started to create more complex facades, composed of several layers, using the most varied materials in combination. From there, the appearance of the facades and consequently of the building is largely determined by the way in which shading, ventilation, and insulation of the interior space is obtained. Glass itself, considered by many to be an inappropriate material when applied to large surfaces, has become a component of highly efficient solutions in terms of climate and energy. It all depends on how the material is used. In these two examples, double glass walls, in combination with openings at their lower and upper sides, act as regulators of the interior temperature, trapping and extracting the heat in hot days and keeping it within in cold ones. In an excellent text written in 1997, Chilean architect Rodrigo Pérez de Arce classifies facades into three types: the smooth facade, the articulated facade, and the porous facade. The curtain wall is a uniform, homogeneous, dematerialized, and transparent envelope, which represents a radical separation between structure and closure. From a conceptual point of view, the curtain wall has no thickness and does not allow radical changes, only variations. Its beginnings date back to the first decades of the 20th century, in built works by Gropius and theoretical projects by Mies van der Rohe. The lever house constitutes an important point in the evolution of the curtain wall. At this point in time, there were no industrially produced curtain walls, and the SOM office had to design the lever house curtain wall completely. After that point, it became something produced industrially. And the curtain wall doesn't have to be the thing we know in office buildings. It could be also played with, as in this case in the Eames house, in which the overall design of the curtain wall resembles something that could be produced by Mondrian, something to do with the production of uh, that Dutch group, the De Stijl building, the neoplasticists. And of course, more recently, there appeared curtain walls which are not orthogonal, which have very different designs but keep the same basic characteristics of the original curtain walls. Still part of this category, there is the lattice wall, where a surface created by hollow ceramic or concrete elements, wood or steel slats, etc., define the outer limits of the building, creating some kind of space between itself and the glass. The porous facade is a three-dimensional phenomenon, as it has to do with the subtraction of spaces from the volume of the building, creating external areas in general for collective use. The first variety of articulated facades is the balconied facade. The balcony, either protruding or recessed, implies the creation of an artificial ground, a kind of substitute for the exterior garden. The protruding version is linked to the characteristic cantilevers of modern architecture, while the recessed version is linked to historical loggias. The second variety of the articulated facade derives from the concept of elevated streets. Transferring circulation and interchange space is characteristic of urban space to the domain of the building. The original elevated street by the Smithsons in the Golden Lane project, and its real application first in Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, in this interior street, which was to be dedicated to commercial spaces, and in several housing schemes in which the circulation is a kind of open air street open to one side. The following kind of facade is the furniture facade, where there is a thickening caused by the act of embedding a piece of furniture as an integral part of the wall. There are countless examples of this in the history of architecture, but in recent times, the best examples appear in the work of Louis Kahn. At the Fisher House, there is a combination of window frame with seating and storage, whereas at the Exeter Library, the carrels are totally integrated with the tall windows in the reading areas of the building. Finally, what we call a mask facade, in which a second layer creates an interstitial space that can serve several uses. Its origin seems to be the initial work of Le Corbusier, from which in the 1970s the idea of composing a layered facade was extracted. While some architects explored this idea from an exclusively visual point of view, others applied it in a more pragmatic way. In the Kresge College project, the outer layer is the one that defines the face that the building presents to the surroundings, while the inner layer accommodates openings where necessary. The double facade appeared in the work of Louis Kahn as a way to control the effects of the sun, glare, and heat. Perforated walls, which he called ruins, were wrapped around spaces in order to protect them by keeping them in shade, since openings were kept inside these intermediate spaces, which at times can be used as recessed balconies. Here is the project in which he started to think about the so-called ruins wrapped around the building. And here, one of the projects in which he was able to employ this resource to very, very good effect. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you come back for the next ones. Take care.